Just a few moments ago, Rich read to you what we commonly call the Beatitudes, a series of blessings that are the beginning part of a much larger body of material. This is Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, which spreads across 3 chapters of the Gospel of Matthew. And it has been called the greatest sermon ever preached. Jesus is at a high point in his ministry. Crowds are streaming towards him, men and women from all over. They come to see him, to meet him, to be healed by him. And they draw in close around so that they can hear what Jesus has to say. And Jesus has to climb up to a higher place. And there he begins to pronounce this series of blessings. But these are strange blessings, at least unexpected ones. Blessed are the poor in spirit, he begins. Now, none of us want to be poor. None of us want to be poor in spirit. None of us wants to ache for God's presence or feel the kind of incompleteness which this phrase seems to capture. Tom Long calls the poor in spirit spiritual beggars. They know their need for God. And so begins a list that includes those who are grief-stricken, those who are humble, the peacemakers, the pure in heart, those who are being persecuted for righteousness' sake. Some might respond, well, how is there blessing in those things? Indeed, why would Jesus say that? And in truth, the blessing, it begins the very moment the words are spoken and the words are heard in the ears and understood in the hearts of those whom Jesus identifies. To the poor, the grieving, the persecuted, he signals, I see you. I see your struggles. I hear you. I hear your cries. So imagine what that feels like for them. Sitting in a great crowd, probably feeling quite anonymous, and then to be recognized, to be affirmed, to be loved, to be told, you matter. You will see God. And it's a shame, though, isn't it, that we live in a world that prefers to shroud the weak, to cover over the hurt, to turn away from the wounded. And when we suffer, well, we learn to be quiet. We cover up the injuries. Sometimes we absent ourselves from community right at the moment when we most need it. But that does not salve the wounds, the pain, it lingers. And even when we think we have gotten beyond it, the ache returns, fierce and fresh. Blessed are those who mourn, Jesus says. Among the Beatitudes, that may be the very hardest one, because in grief, we arrive at a full awareness of our powerlessness. Something has happened over which we have no control. Something or someone has been lost. It could be something seemingly simple, at least in the eyes of someone else. A new job, a transfer, maybe it's a promotion, but you're not with the same work group now, and the work's not so familiar to you. Or you might be a high schooler who's been injured in your sport and you can't travel with the team. You're missing your friends, but others, they don't quite see that. Well, some years ago, a friend of mine, he was looking after his parents' house while they were away. And a neighbor called to say the house had been broken into. He asked me to go with him to check things out. And as we went inside, I looked around and everything looked fine to me. There were some scratches at the back door, but nothing was broken. Everything seemed to be in place. And I said, well, you got off easy. No, No, we didn't, he snapped back. My mother's special clock on the mantle, it's gone. And she always kept a pair of sterling silver candlesticks on the dining room table. I think they were a wedding present. They're gone too. And around the house we went with him pointing out what was no longer there, losses that mattered. But I couldn't see. There are so many losses that make for grief. A family pet. We've been talking a lot about our pets lately. They are having trouble in this deep snow. But never underestimate the emotional trauma that comes from losing a pet. It hurts whenever we lose someone we care for. And then there are those deeply life-changing losses of a parent or grandparents, a sibling or a spouse or a child. It hurts, even to imagine these losses, how much more it hurts to soldier through them. And yet in those losses, there is always love. We don't grieve deeply someone we never knew. It is those closest to us, even if they failed us along the way and we missed out on a more fully caring relationship. The grief, it's real. Our heart is shattered and we cannot put it back together. Grief and love, they are close companions. I was so saddened early on as a pastor to talk with an older woman who had recently retired as a school librarian. I said to her, "I'm sure you miss the children." And she said, "No, I really don't." But she said, "I made a point not to get close to them. I didn't want to get hurt." And in fact, she had been hurt. At a much younger age, after a bright, energetic child had caught her attention, she adored that child. But tragically, that girl was lost. And the librarian, she decided not to go through that pain again. And I wondered how much love was lost along the way by her and by the many children with whom she interacted through decades of loveless work. Jesus grieves in the New Testament. He breaks down when others are weeping over the loss of his dear friend Lazarus. The Gospel of John records this moment when Jesus saw Mary, that is Lazarus' sister. When Jesus saw Mary weeping and the Jews who were coming along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" Jesus asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. And that, if you don't know, is the shortest verse in the Bible, and perhaps one of the most profound. Just 2 words, Jesus wept. Among the ancient Roman and Greek philosophers, many argued that mourning was a sign of weakness, an irrational response to the natural order of things. That's certainly what the Stoics thought, emotions and passions for them being much, much lower than thinking and reason. Women were allowed to weep, but men were expected to hold their emotions in check. They still are. But Judaism had a slightly different take. Here I'm drawing on the work of a scholar named Hans Dieter Betz, who notes that long before the New Testament, mourning became a common metaphor to describe the response of the faithful to the degraded state of affairs in the life of Israel. I quote now, "This response was regarded as proper for the righteous, in stark contrast to the frivolous and cynical who do not care." End of quote. Jesus knows this particular grief. Luke describes what happens when Jesus enters in Jerusalem. He's being hailed by the crowds that shout Hosanna and being jeered by the Pharisees who complain, "Teacher, tell your followers to shut up." But of course, Jesus is not going to stop their celebration because the Pharisees object. But then the mood darkens. Luke writes, as he came near and saw the city, he wept over it. Jesus weeps over what should be there, but is not. The love of justice, the love of truth, the practice of kindness and mutual forbearing, a kind of absence that others may simply not notice, like an empty spot on the mantle where a prized clock once sat. Some people, they don't see it, or they've trained themselves not to. A character in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment declares, man, meaning humanity, grows used to everything, the scoundrel. And too often we are tempted to excuse the inexcusable, ignore the gap between what is and what should be. We go along at times, well, to get along. In a former congregation, I had several parishioners who grew up in Eastern Europe in repressive police states. Notorious reigns these were. Ceausescu in Romania, Hoxha in Albania. I asked them, what was that like to be a child in such oppressive circumstances? And they each said, we didn't know anything was wrong. We were just kids. It all seemed so normal to us, only because their parents made it seem normal. To protect them, no doubt, the parents kept their feelings inside, their worries, their fears, their opinions about the indignities they or their neighbors faced. Never were these spoken aloud. Jesus weeps for his people. He weeps for the nation. If you, even you, he laments, had only recognized this day the things that make for peace. He knows the history of suffering. He also knows what will come. A grave calamity lies ahead for Jerusalem and its people. If only you had recognized the things that make for peace. Well, many among us have been experiencing this same grief, a feeling that something important is missing, that some vital ideals, or principles, or hopes are threatened and may vanish away. I've asked some of you, and friends as well, what you have been mourning. And I've heard a sense of peace is missing. Trust has been lost. Feeling safe, not now. A parent told me, I want to raise a child who's empathetic, but I'm fearful about what they may see or hear or experience. Another described to me a sense of moral disorientation in our own land. That is a good thing. A good thing to notice that the world is not right, and to feel it and to name it, because that is the only way we can respond to it. That's the only way that things will ever change. It is the only way we will ever seek to make things better. Blessed are those who mourn. It's a sign of life within. It is the outcome of loving deeply, caring passionately, having a moral center that rejects cruelty, hatred, violence against anyone, no matter who they are. Well, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to have a time tomorrow night set aside for healing in our personal and corporate lives. In preparation for that, Amber sent along a poem that says a lot about being alive to the experience of others. It's by a young Pakistani poet. Her name is Iqra Arshad. I'll read it to you. Being a deep feeler was something I didn't like in myself at first. I didn't know then how extraordinary it could be. I only saw the heavy side of it. And I kept asking myself, why am I like this? Why do I feel everything so deeply and so completely? But now I see the other side and I cherish it, because if I'm feeling deeply, it means my heart is not limited to my own pain. It means I can sense the ache in others, the people I love, even when they hide it well. Some people never notice that the person beside them is exhausted, breaking, hurting. But if I can sense it, I can make a difference. I can ask, I can listen, I can show up, I can try to lift them, to remind them they are not alone. Jesus blesses those who are in mourning. And to that he adds a promise: they will be comforted. No doubt there's an eschatological dimension to this promise, that in the end grief will not prevail. We affirm this as followers of Christ. But perhaps that promise may also function in a different way. Might it be a promise to send companions, to bring fellow travelers for a difficult journey, a communion and community of those who care? But the fulfillment of that promise, it depends upon us. Folk like you and me who are willing to ask, willing to listen, and ready to show up for those who are hurting, to offer kindness, to practice mercy, to be the peacemakers. And that means entering into the struggle and perhaps being reviled for it. That is our blessing, according to Christ. The poet whom I cited earlier concludes her piece this way: and when I go to bed, after all of that, I have the peaceful satisfaction that I lived that day, even if it tired me, even if I felt too much, because even with all that, there is still much joy. May it be so.